Neve, in our last video we talked about what the scientific process is and what steps it involves. So before we get started, can you remind us what the steps are?
Yeah, so the first step is finding a question that we want to know the answer to. The second step then is to design an experiment to answer your question. The third step is performing the experiment. The fourth step is looking at the results and trying to make sense of them. And the fifth step is drawing a conclusion from your results.
Exactly. And we talked about the fact that the scientific process is something which anybody can use to ask and answer questions about the world around them. And that really, it's a little bit more like a cycle, because once we find the answer to one question, we start on another question, or we can ask the same question but in a different way.
That's it. So in this video, we're going to talk about the first step, finding a question we want to know the answer to. So we need to find a question we want to know the answer to. Have you got any ideas?
Well, I don't know, Neve, but there is a topic that I've been thinking a lot about recently. So we keep the comb jellies here in the tanks in the lab, and to get the comb jellies there, we have to go fishing by the sea. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when we go down to the harbour, there's often a lot of rubbish in the water, roughly in the same area where we find the comb jellies. A lot of this rubbish is made out of plastic, and some of it is really, really big, but some of it is really, really tiny. And these very small plastics are called microplastics.
Yeah, and remember one time we were collecting our comb jellies, we found some of the animals had plastic inside them, which made us think that maybe they had eaten it.
This is it, Neve, and sometimes I wonder what impact these microplastics are having on our animals and other animals that live in the sea. And I think they could be having a particularly big impact on our comb jellies because of the way that they feed. One of the interesting things about comb jellies is their tentacles, because unlike other kinds of jellyfish, these guys have sticky, not stingy tentacles. And comb jellies use their tentacles to feed.
That's right. Comb jellies eat things like copepods, which are small little shrimp that swim around in the water with the comb jellies. Sometimes these copepods get stuck on the comb jelly's sticky tentacles, and the comb jelly senses this and pulls the tentacles in very close to its body, and then spins very quickly to bring the food to its mouth.
So some microplastics are roughly the same size as copepods, and because we don't think that they can control what gets stuck to their tentacles, the comb jellies might be eating microplastics. And I wonder, what impact does that have on the animal itself?
This is a good question, but let's take a step back for a second. Do we know how much microplastic is in the ocean, or whereabouts in the ocean we tend to find microplastics? Maybe before we start asking questions about the impact of microplastics on comb jellies and other animals, we first need to know the answer to that question.
Yeah, that makes sense, Neve. We need to know how much microplastic is in the ocean and where it is, so that we start looking in the right places. So then our question would be, how much microplastic is in the ocean?
Yeah, so this is a much better starting point. But remember, there are a few things that make a good scientific question. Number one is our question should be something that we find really interesting, because there's no point going to all this trouble for something we don't even care about.
Yeah, and this question definitely meets that criteria because it's something that we both find interesting.
So yes, that is a really interesting question, but the second thing a scientific question needs to be is specific. And I don't think asking how much microplastic is in the entire ocean is a very specific question.
Yeah, you're right, Neve. And this is a really important feature because the way that we answer scientific questions is all about making measurements and observations. And if our question is too broad, it becomes really hard to do that. So, in our case, if we want to know how much microplastic is in the ocean, we can't possibly sample all of the seawater in all of the oceans of the world.
But sometimes the big questions are the most interesting and the ones that we really want to answer.
That's right, Neve, but it doesn't mean that we can't tackle the big questions. We just need to break them down into smaller pieces.
Well, we catch our comb jellies at Howth Harbour, so how about instead of asking how much microplastic is in the entire ocean, we just focus on how much microplastics is found in the sea at Howth Harbour.
Yeah, that's nice and specific. Okay, so Neve, we know our question needs to be interesting and it needs to be specific. Is there anything else that we have to consider?
Well, the final thing is we need to make sure that it's actually feasible to get to the answer of our question. So when we think about feasibility, we need to ask, do we have everything we need to answer our question? We need to think about what resources we have, how much time, what equipment, and what skills we have.
And sometimes things like these can feel like it limits us. but actually there's some really creative and fun way to get around these.
One of these is to work with more people and to work with people who have a different set of skills and expertise to you. That helps you with your constraints around time and the skills that you have.
Another way of getting around your constraints is to build the equipment you will use to answer your question, if you don't already have what you need. This is something that we do quite a bit here in our lab, and it's something that we're going to show you how to do later on in the series. So now we have our scientific question: how much microplastic is in the sea at Hoth Harbour in County Dublin? And in doing so, we have completed step 1 of the scientific process.
So in the next video, we're going to work on the second step of the scientific process, designing an experiment. So we're going to be thinking about the steps that we need to take to get to the answer of our question.